Morning, everybody. With some delay and some of our attendees still recovering from last night and arriving and sending messages, I'm going to welcome you all for our second day of City Debates. Again, very happy and excited to have you to discuss, moderate, and share this first panel. We have Petra Samaha. Petra is very proudly one of our stellar graduates from this program about 10 years ago, 7 years ago, 9? Oh my God. Petra is currently following a PhD at Sciences Po in urban planning / politics. Working on issues of property and land. Her full bio is on your website and in the programs that you have. She's done way more than I can talk here. She's also a fantastic activist working to change things in Beirut, which you don't see on her bio, but you should ask her after the panel. So I'll leave the floor to you, Petra, and thank you for playing this role.
Thanks a lot, Mona, for the intimidating introduction. It's good to be back here after so long. So I'm going to be discussing the first panel titled Opportunities for Land Value Capture. And we're going to have 3 speakers. I'm going to introduce the 3 and then leave the floor to them. I'm going to try to keep time, like 15-20 minutes per presentation, so we can have a full 25 minutes for the discussion. So our first presentation is titled Using Land Value Capture and Local Area Development Planning to Foster Adequate Housing by Deena Khalil. Deena is a development planner and urban researcher and is currently manager of the MENA Urban Housing Practitioners Hub at Habitat for Humanity International, and also assistant professor in the sociology department at AUC and a founding member at the Network of Urban Studies in Egypt. There's a lot more in her bio, and you can also check it online. Our second presentation is titled Public Value Capture, Climate Change and the Infrastructure Gap and the Context of Development Rights Allocation Processes in Greece. But we're going to hear much more than only about Greece by Nikos Karadimitriou from UCL. Nikos is Associate Professor in Planning and Urban Development at UCL. His recent work focuses on planning reform efforts in Greece during the public debt crisis, the way public value capture could be used to fund climate change resilient urban infrastructure, and the way housing markets shape the spatiality of multiple deprivation and social segregation. Also, Nico work as an advisory or consultant, and you can read more about his work in the bio as well. And last but not least, the presentation titled Climate Value and Land Capture by Richard Dunning, Liverpool University. Richard's work focuses on explaining human decision-making in the built environment, drawing from behavioral economics. His research considers calculations of housing need, the relationship between public outcomes and land value capture, and cycling infrastructures. And this has been instrumental in defining affordable housing subsidies in Scotland and determining land value capture mechanisms in England. He has also worked and is working in many other contexts: Netherlands, France, Germany, the UK, China, and I'll let you read the rest in his bio. So, Deena, the floor is yours. I'm gonna try and keep the time,
Thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you all for joining this panel today. And I'm happy to start off day 2 of the City Debates after the very successful and interesting conversation we all had yesterday. And I'm going to start off by talking about land value capture in relation to slum upgrading or the upgrading of informal areas more broadly. But first I want to preface my presentation by saying that I'm not actually a land person. I'm a housing and informality person, and that's very much the perspective that I'll be speaking to you all from today. So for a bit of context, I'll be speaking mostly about the context of Cairo. When I refer to Cairo, I'm talking about the Greater Cairo region, which is a massive urban agglomeration made up of 3 different governorates, partially or in their entirety, with a collective population of around 20 million people. So we're really speaking about a huge population, with around 60% of which are living informally, living in informal areas with various degrees of adequacy or inadequacy, which I'll get to in a minute. And I think it's important also to provide context to the distinction I'm making between slums and informal areas. This distinction is not just a matter of semantics or negative connotations or anything like that, but it's also a distinction that is reflected in Egypt's urban planning policy and legislation. So in 2008, the Egyptian government set up a national entity, a national agency, known as the Informal Settlement Development Facility, or the ISDF. This organization was tasked with mapping all informal areas around the country and classifying those informal areas into two types of areas. And this is reflected in the Building Law of 119 as well, so it's reflected in the legislation. Those two classifications are areas that are unplanned and areas that are unsafe. Areas that are unsafe, which is the image that you see on the right of the screen, are areas that pose some kind of safety risk to the residents that inhabit those areas. So it could be due to the area's geographic location. For example, it's on the slope of a hill or in the pathway of a flood. That safety risk could be because it poses a public health threat to the residents. So, for example, the reliance on septic tanks or other informal sewage mechanisms, or it's the areas on a solid waste dump site, or the buildings are directly below high voltage electricity cable. So all of these examples exist. Or it could be simply because the buildings are not constructed properly and therefore they are prone to collapse. So these are areas that pose a safety risk, as I mentioned, and therefore in many cases necessitate relocation of the residents to other areas. And of course, complete demolishment of the areas. Unplanned areas, on the other hand, pose no such risks. The buildings are safe, they're well constructed, and the area is in need of development, targeted development and planning interventions. And through those interventions, the area can then, the living standards can be raised to meet at least the minimum standard of adequate housing. And they do not necessitate relocation in that sense. So it's important to note that the ISDF, first of all, it estimates that urban areas countrywide are 76% informal. So among that entire 76% of informal areas across the country, only 1% of that are unsafe areas. So only 1% necessitate relocation of the residents. The remaining 75% of those areas do not need relocation, but only need, as I mentioned, development, physical planning interventions, maybe some replanning in some cases, some de-densification in other cases, upgrading of the infrastructure, renovation of homes, things of that nature. This is very important to note because the sheer scale of unplanned areas, making up 75% of urban areas across the country, with a slightly lower but not too far percentage within the Greater Cairo region, combined with the nature of the types of interventions that are needed, poses a huge financial burden for the agencies that are responsible for the upgrading of informal areas in Egypt and in Cairo. So rather than relying on transfers from central government or grants and loans from various agencies, which is what the ISDF and other agencies mostly rely on now, land value capture can potentially play a very important role in fulfilling that gap, in providing an alternative source of financing that makes it more possible for agencies such as the ISDF to self-finance and to be able to upgrade informal areas more easily. And there are instruments that are present in Egyptian legislation. In addition to that, the ISDF itself outlines land value capture as part of its approach without actually labeling it as land value capture. This quote is from the very first annual national plan that the ISDF developed in 2010. Although subsequent or annual plans have been produced, but the approach is still what they follow today. And I'll read out this quote. The plan says cost recovery areas, so it's speaking about informal areas specifically, not all areas. Cost recovery informal areas are characterized by their low density, which allows for the intensification of facilities and the utilization of vacant lands, or the increase in the value of the land due to its distinguished location, which allows either to recover the cost or extract additional resources, known as value-added areas, which can be used then in dealing with other non-recoverable areas. So this means that the annual plan basically outlines that certain informal areas may lie on land where value creation is a present possibility. And the value of those lands should be created and captured and then used to finance upgrading in areas that are not as valuable in regards to the value of the land, such as the image I have on the right of the screen. The image I have on the left of the screen, I chose because this is the image of an informal area known as Ain al-Sira. If there are any other Egyptians in the room, you've probably heard of it. Ain al-Sira is an informal area, parts of which were classified as unsafe. And it has since been, parts of it have been demolished, the residents relocated to social housing projects on the outskirts of the city. And the area has been redeveloped into the image that you see on the right, which is recreational facilities targeting middle class and upper middle class consumers. There is a theme park, cafes and restaurants, boats that people can rent to move around on this, what was previously this spring, now known as Cairo Lake, completely privately owned. So it has not been used to refinance the recovery of other informal areas. So informal areas, in the sense that the value of their land can be captured or can be created, that is something that is commonly taken place in the context of Greater Cairo. But the question is, who's capturing that value? In addition to the fact that the instruments actually exist in the Egyptian legislation, developer exactions are mentioned in the Egyptian law, the Building Law of 119 of 2008, and it allows the city to charge a building permit or a permit fee to developers who are replanning existing areas. However, this fee has a ceiling, which is extremely low, and only 1% of that is retained locally. The rest goes back into central government, and it's not widely applied at all. So it's their Egyptian experience with implementing these developer exactions has actually been very limited. So what we're really saying, and this goes back to something that Dr. Silva and Dr. Jaber were talking about yesterday, is that we're seeing very much land value creation and land value capture without any distribution of that land value. And these images showcase another example of that. So the image on the left is an area that is very well known in Cairo. I would almost use the term infamous because of how controversial it has been. It's an area known as the Maspero Triangle. Has anybody heard of the Maspero Triangle? Okay, so if you've heard of it, you probably know that it's been at the center of a lot of controversy in regards to forced eviction, the right of informal area dwellers to be present in the city, and what constitutes public land versus private land, and a number of other questions that were raised in yesterday's keynote speech. The image on the right, so this area, just to mention, this area has since been completely demolished. Over 90% of the residents, if not more, have been relocated. And the image on the right is what the private developer is now selling as a vision, known as Maspero Mall and City Edge. So it's presenting glossy residential and building units and recreational facilities, once again, to middle and upper class consumers. Because of this, we are witnessing the phenomenon of land value capture being associated with another phenomenon that some scholars have described as slum gentrification. This image that you see here, it represents the relocation of two unsafe areas on the right-hand side of the map, which are Duwea and Stabla Antar. Those two areas are unsafe. They were demolished and the residents were relocated over 40 kilometers away in another city known as Masakin Osman, in the city of 6th of October. Of course, far away from their employment and livelihood opportunities, far away from their social networks. And I won't go into the specificities of Masakin Osman, but it was problematic and undeveloped, to say the least. Life became so intolerable for them that many of the residents ended up moving back to their original slums, despite the fact that their homes had been demolished. They went to the areas that had not been demolished and tried to search for housing all over again in this informal area, just so that they could be connected to the city and all the opportunities that it provides. And the problem is that oftentimes when we see the poor pushed out of these informal areas, it often entails that they are pushed out of the city as a whole. Another thing that was mentioned by Dr. Silva and Dr. Jaber in the keynote speech yesterday was that oftentimes ideological visions of the city can generate or can create land value in a way that's far more effective than any public investment in infrastructure or FAR or any other tools. This is something that is very much taking place in the context of Greater Cairo. This image here is from an official document, a city vision known as Cairo 2050. I would also use the term infamous to describe this. This city vision was extremely controversial. It has since been amended, but many of the same projects exist. And you'll see that the slogan is a city that is global, green, and connected. Oftentimes that translates to mean modern, civilized, technologically advanced, pristine, uniform, and modern, like I said, and no space really for informality. And it really raises the question of, is there space for the poor in this vision or not? Like I mentioned, many of the same projects exist, such as this one. The image on the left is an island in Greater Cairo, known as El Warre. And you can see that the island is on the left. It is primarily informal, with the word informal also with a question mark under it, because it's a historic area. And parts of it are still very much agricultural. The image on the right is how this area is envisioned to be redeveloped. So it's from the private developer that has been given the development rights to replan and redevelop this area after the residents are relocated. If there's one word I would use to describe the image on the right, it is glossy. Lots of glossy tower, very Dubai-esque, and very much not in line with what the area looks like now, and very much not in line with how the residents live their lives now, how they earn their livelihood. There is a lot of mistrust between residents and the government because of all these examples that we've been seeing of residents being pushed out of the city completely, being pushed out to either the city periphery or moved to other suburbs of the city in order to make way for development that is targeting middle and upper class consumers. Local area development planning can create opportunities to rebuild this trust, and it can also highlight capital generating avenues within communities and how this capital can then be captured and redistributed within the community itself. There are examples of this that have taken place in the context of Greater Cairo. Since 2018, the Egyptian government, through various agencies, has partnered with development agencies and private development consultancies to produce participatory local area development plans in 10 informal neighborhoods across Greater Cairo. The local area development plans look at each area's available resources, potentials, needs, and they present multiple scenarios for the use of vacant land. So they produce scenarios where this vacant land can be used to construct private recreational facilities, or they can be used to construct services, public services for the neighborhood. So they present different ways in which the value of this land can be really created and captured, and then how it can be redistributed to the residents. And it very much integrates the physical needs of the area and the physical planning interventions that are required with the socioeconomic needs of the area, and how its economy can be boosted, how livelihood opportunities can be created for the residents through perhaps working or supporting these recreational facilities that are built on the vacant land. And most importantly, the LADPs are participatory. They're produced in cooperation with the residents, and through workshops and meetings and a number of other participatory planning tools and approaches. Unfortunately, sometimes even that is not enough to protect residents from being displaced from the city. The case of Maspero is a case in point, where there was a massive participatory planning project that took place there. In the end, what we just saw ended up happening anyway, but it can be successful, and I don't think it's a tool that should be given up on because of the potentials that it holds for ensuring that land value capture is actually captured for the benefit of the residents. Thank you very much. Right on time.
So, good morning, everyone. I think I need to. So, good morning, and many thanks to the American University, Mona, and her team, as well as the ULI for inviting me here. It's great to be here. My presentation is based on a paper I did actually with another participant, Sonia Gelton, and a colleague from Greece and Portugal. And it's about, let's say, informality, public value capture, and in coastal areas in Greece and in France, and how these can be used to, how public value capture can be used to fund what I call the infrastructure gap. So I'll start a bit with a very brief discussion on informality, just to clarify what type of informality the paper talks about. Then the process of legalization, the process of allocation of development rights in Greece. Then we'll look into France and what happened there, just as a comparator. And the presentation will finish with some conclusions and policy recommendations, some insights from the comparison, also findings from the analysis of the data that we did, and some policy recommendations for the use of public value capture. So the background to this paper is another paper I published with a colleague, Thanos Pagonis from Athens. In the Greek context, there are two processes, let's say, two practices of grabbing. One is land grabbing, the second one is violation of planning norms and regulations. And we broke those down to various subcategories, but for us, what's the most interesting thing is actually the way these practices are exercised and happen every day, not by the poor and dispossessed and so on. Greece is actually a high-income country, so and polarization, social polarization is not that great. So there is not a big need for housing and so on. I mean, informal housing and so on, as for example in Egypt. We're looking about how the middle class exercises those practices, engages in those practices. And we also looked at the pre-crisis and post-crisis, I mean the Greek public debt crisis, and we structured those in 11 pathways before the crisis and 13 after the crisis. And basically we saw that the planning system and the way development rights are allocated in and out of the planning system is split in two. It's the formal practices, the informal practices, and the informal practices, or what we would call unplanned development, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different pathways, of which development without permit on a land that is not owned by the person building is only one. All this happens, and it's quite widespread. All this happens in a context of climate change, which is going to influence southern and southeastern Europe much more than many other places on the planet. And there are some estimates of, let's say, the potential costs and the potential damages. They are, for example, GDP losses due to sea level rise alone in Europe would be between 4 and 6%, but sea level rise is going to be especially pronounced in the Mediterranean, for example. So in Greece, there are estimates that, for example, in the Athens seafront, the sea would go up to 60 centimeters higher, which is actually quite a lot if you look at the type the city is built in relation to the coastline. Of course, forest fires, floods, flash flooding, and so on, very, very pronounced. Athens, I think, is in the top of the list of the city with the greatest vulnerabilities when it comes to climate change, especially urban heat island and flooding. So, an additional complication from the coastal character of the city is that, of course, it has a very strong seasonal element to it. The seasonality also means that it's very hard to plan for the needs of the population. In the summer, population doubles, triples in some locations. So you have a layer of planning need in terms of the infrastructure that you need to put in place, which goes up and down a lot during the year, but also an element of people living there whom you cannot estimate. So let me just explain what we meant by informality of need versus informality of desire. Informality of need is what we were talking about before, and also what most people are familiar with, but informality of desire is as the word says, comes from just circumventing planning regulations or engaging in informal activities, not because you need to, but because you want to, or because you kind of fancy a swimming pool. I actually this is from an island reasonably close to Athens, where swimming pools are not allowed. I'm just giving you an example, yeah? And everybody has a swimming pool, and that's to conserve water, yeah? So in a place which is dry, as you can see, everybody has a swimming pool, and also everybody exceeds the planning coefficient quite a lot, and so on and so forth. So that's the type of development we're going to talk about. So as I said, the key issue here is that this type of informality basically creates an infrastructure gap, and an infrastructure gap which you cannot really measure because you don't know, A, how much the real population using this territory is. A lot of this development is also happens for tourist purposes, for tourist reasons. The developments I showed you are mostly used as Airbnbs or rooms for rent and so on, and the taxpayer has to foot the bill. Yeah, so it's both seasonality and difficulty to measure, to estimate. Now, in the Greek context, and to a large extent in the French context, as we found out, the costs are borne by the taxpayer generally, not locally. And that is actually creates an issue of equity and, of course, an issue of fairness. Yeah? So the infrastructure gap itself, in the context of climate change, presents what you in planning you would call a problem which is not only difficult to grasp, but a problem which is very difficult to tackle as well. I would say that, just to give you an example, I would just say that we need to, in the paper we focus on how we can fund it, therefore, how we can fund this infrastructure gap, how we can provide local level public infrastructure, and how we can use public value capture to fund some of that, especially in coastal areas where this type of informality is rife. So the case study areas we looked at, and I will focus more on the Greek ones in Athens, is the coastal area of Athens, the Athens Riviera, and Sonia looked into the Atlantic coast, Vendée. This is how they look like. The top is Athens, the bottom is France. Very quick look. The framework we used for the public value capture is basically comes from Hendricks, recurring and singular forms of public value capture. The interesting thing to note here is that the area in Athens is one of the most upmarket ones, but varies greatly in terms of market prices. The coast can go up, the coastal prices can go up to 10,000 euros per square meter. Inland, it drops to 1,500 to 2,000. So a big variation in prices and in the qualities, but all of them are sort of good quality housing or very high-end housing. And the type of informality we looked at is this, yeah? So it's, closing off a balcony or, the ground floor, which used to be a parking lot, a pilotis, is now closed off and becomes an apartment, and so on and so forth. So this type of stuff. And that was sort of common practice, and nobody knew how much of it was until there was a legalization practice when the country signed the first memorandum of understanding with the IMF to actually tackle this as well. And one of the ways this was tackled was through a structured, organized legalization process where you would declare it and you would pay what turned out to be a very small fine, but eventually 2.4 billion were collected out of that. So and that happened at the same time when an annual real estate tax was brought in force. So basically, a lot of property first appeared in the system and then was taxed. Yeah. So that was a combined effort to basically capture some of that value. And as I said, 2.4 million were collected. Now, these are some numbers for the coastal areas, for the 3 municipalities. It's a very small fraction of Athens. Yeah? It's a very small part of Athens, of what is called now, what is marketed as the Athens Riviera. And the interesting thing here to note is that the first column shows you the first column on table 3 is the construction surface, and the first column on table 2 is the actual amounts. And you can see that the first legalization round, 2011 to 2013, actually has the smallest amounts and the smallest square meters, and that is because at that point in time, what was legalized was what was there. But that actually incentivized people to do more of what I showed you in expectation of the next round. So developers and actually lots of landowners, property owners, normalized this process. And then the second round and third round, you can see that the square meters and the amounts collected actually multiplied by 10 or even more, yeah? So in the end, we're talking about of millions of square meters and actually millions of euros as well collected. Now, however, even those receipts don't cover the infrastructure gap. To give you an example, that waterfront has a big flooding problem, and chronically, historically, and more so now. And that problem is created also by infrastructure from the past, like a big motorway crossing the coast. So basically, the plan is to build appropriate flood defense measures. It's a very hard approach to it, and put the motorway under the surface. And like a few hundred meters of that, which is done now, is going to cost 100 million euro. Yeah, and it's just, that area is 5 or 6 kilometers, and we're doing a few hundred meters. So you can imagine, the disruption, the direct cost, not the indirect cost from disruption and drops in property values and lost revenue from the shops and so on. So what is even more interesting is that although the real estate tax is the kind of annual collection, let's say, facility, and actually yields the highest amounts, it is not ring-fenced. It goes to a central fund, to the central government budget, and is then distributed otherwise. And of the amounts collected for the fines, which are ring-fenced and go to a central fund, only 2.5% per year can be used for green projects or any kind of infrastructure like that. The rest is actually held in a kind of escrow account and then is offset against debt. So this must be over 3.5 billion now, which is 1.5% of GDP almost. And that is an accounting method to reduce the level of public debt, basically. So a lot of money is collected, but nobody knows exactly where they're going. And if we know where they're going, they're not used for the purpose they were supposed to be used. Now, in France, a similar but different situation. Similar practices to those, also another practice called cabanisation, where people are given by the state the right to put a tent, for example, close to the coast, and then they build a home around that. As I understood, not very many people are looking into this, so there's no good estimate of exactly the extent of the phenomenon, but it's very localized. For example, in the area around Montpellier, about 1 in 3 homes is affected by this, or is actually built like that, whereas other areas are not affected at all. In the case study area in Vendée, the interesting thing, from an academic point of view at least, is that a major flooding disaster happened, and that showed that basically the majority of the homes that were destroyed were actually built through these processes of either cabanisation or informal kind of extension of development rights and so on. So in that area, for example, there is actually one ongoing project to tackle flooding, the sea level rise. That's going to cost 21 million only. Yeah, I mean, only that. So again, the needs are huge, but the money is not there. It's not been collected, and again, there's a tax system in place, but again, it's not ring-fenced, and of course there are big fines, but nobody's collecting them, more or less. So additionally, there's a big incentive to engage in these practices because you sell the house for more, and the tax regime is also beneficial, let's say, by not taking into account, for example, these square meters into your annual tax pay, real estate tax, and so on and so forth. So there are very strict laws. They're not enforced. actually these practices are promoted in a way by local practices quite a lot. And we asked ourselves why. Why is this happening? Why there is one regime where laws are forbidding this and the planning system is adamant, that planners are adamant that no, this can't happen. Actually, the discourse is that this doesn't happen. But it does happen, and it's not only happens, but if you look at the details, it is promoted. Yeah, the tax system promotes it. The way property is sold and bought allows it. Nobody's demolishing anything. The court, the high court, actually puts restrictions on planning enforcement. So you can't demolish something if it's very difficult to demolish something. Let's say there are very severe limitations. And we were wondering why that happens. And the first one is that actually profits can be substantial from this for private owners and private developers. And secondly, also income can be quite substantial for the state. As I said, a lot of money goes to the public coffers from these practices. And that actually, we thought is, let's say, good if not good, at least tolerable by local politicians, because to demolish homes and to start imposing fines and collecting those taxes and so on is actually not very popular. Whereas turning a blind eye actually is. So at the same time, it's very unclear what the long-term effect on public finances is. When disaster strikes, there's a lot of money needed to actually repair the damage. A lot of these homes are uninsured. The taxpayer foots the bill. And in the context of climate change, we need anyway to provide infrastructure in places where actually, in many cases, development shouldn't happen, or if it happens, it shouldn't happen in this way. So additional layers of infrastructure needed, adaptation of existing infrastructure, new infrastructure, populations which are very volatile and difficult to measure exactly who is using this territory to be able to make the estimates, and costs which are not borne locally. And this is my last slide, yeah? So the policy advice that we came up with was one, that a legalization process actually works as a mechanism to collect public value, basically. And you could fund some of the infrastructure necessary to plug the infrastructure gap in this way. However, to achieve this, you need high enough fines, but not so high as to not make them collectible. And secondly, you need to ring fence the receipts. Then a balance has to be struck between spatial justice and climate resilience. Yeah. Preemptive control is needed, but at the same time, you need to be more active when big infringements happen. Also because in many cases, those infringements cause risk, increase the vulnerability of everybody. For example, when you block the flow of a stream or things like that, yeah? Or you block the access to the sea, and then if there's a forest fire, people cannot escape to the coast. I mean, things like that, yeah? And last but not least, we need to keep in mind that these legalization processes bear the risk of actually promoting informality, as you saw in Greece. It's very tempting for politicians to keep them going and turn them from a mechanism to, let's say, create a more, say, equal and equitable local situation into actually promoting the practice itself by giving off a few freebies to people for a very small fine. I can see some nodding heads, so you know what I'm talking about. So anyway, these are the pitfalls and the advantages of those mechanisms, and one has to bear them in mind when trying to engage with this process. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. Thanks to Mona, who's legged it, for inviting us to Beirut. It's been a fantastic introduction to the city and the country for me, so thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for showing me new food and new drinks. Thank you for telling me not to mix my drinks last night. That was helpful as well. I'm going to talk about climate value and value capture, a view from the coast. One of my friends asked me why I was going to Lebanon, and I said, I'm going to go and try and persuade people that the land is the sea and the sea is the land. Which is a ridiculously pretentious thing to say, and particularly academic nonsense. But that's my hope in the next kind of 20 minutes, that I'll be able to persuade you that the sea is land and the land is sea. We'll think about climate change and land values. Nikos has touched on many of these issues already. Benefits of land-sea interactions, costs, coastal communities, definitions of land value capture, terrestrialization versus territorialization, and then think very briefly about coastal value capture at the end. I should say some of this work is funded by the NERC, UK funding organisation, under Co-opt, Resilient Coastline, Coasts Optimising Co-Benefits, so go and have a look at the website. And if you're writing on housing and society more broadly, please think about submitting your articles to Housing and Society journal as well. Okay, Enrique last night very helpfully talked about many of the conditions for land value growth or change in land values. He highlighted particularly the fact that the state has a major role to play in determining zoning mechanisms or planning permission for the increase in land value. But he also talked quite extensively about the interaction with the market. And I think it's helpful just to pull up this slide, which shows some of the various determinants of land value capture, and how they relate to each other. So Hong and Brubaker have 5 determinants. They talk about the original productivity of the land, private investment in that land, so somebody putting in a levee or a private road to that land, population growth and economic development, public infrastructure and investment in infrastructure, and then changes in land use regulation, planning permission. Those 5 aspects are not always linked to land value capture, though. It's normally the bottom 3 that are linked to land value capture. The first 2 are sometimes linked to land taxation, as Nikos pointed out as well. But the bottom 3 are really thinking about land value capture. And that's not actually anything to do with their influence on land values. That's to do with the moral argument that when the state intervenes, then the state has the right to recoup some of the uplift in land values. But my contention with that is actually society as a whole creates the value through all 5 of these aspects. And therefore, society as a whole has the right to recoup some of that land value uplift. So we don't want to distinguish too much between the city and citizens, but we want to think about the 2 in combination and how they work dynamically to produce values. From a critical geography perspective as well, we might also want to think about the role of finance and credit here in inflating land prices, if not changing land values. We might also want to think about public confidence in specific land parcels as well, rather than kind of economic growth holistically. I'm very briefly going to touch on how climate change might influence these factors, and then try and persuade you that the sea is the land. Okay, so climate change is going to have very variegated impacts on land values in relation to productivity. Some parts of Canada are very optimistic about land value increases as productivity increases. Other people have said that's absolute nonsense. There'll be no change in productivity from climate change, even in these areas. And there may or may not be a change in land value, even if there is a stability in terms of productivity. And that's because with a scarce resource, there's competition for that scarce resource. So if some areas are being damaged by climate change and other areas stay constant, we might still see an increase in land values in those locations, even if there's no change in productivity. Other areas like Central Europe are seeing a decline in productivity, so forestry is likely to decline in terms of how productive the forest is. But again, scarcity might actually mean that, surprisingly, although productivity decreases, actually land values might still increase in some of these locations through climate change. So that's the kind of original productivity of the land. What about people? How will they influence this and changes in the perceptions of the economy? Well, this is a prepper. He's bought an American, I don't know if it's Air Force or military bunker, and decided to turn it into his home. There's a change with climate change in his perception of what's valuable, of what's significant in life, and that changes this person's consumption behaviour. And there are amazing examples of people buying these bunkers, putting in swimming pools underground, putting in kind of green forests underneath as well. So private investment, you could see that as, or you could see in public confidence as well, changing the location of land demand and therefore land values. As a side note, preppers also see the end of markets, which changes our understanding of land-based finance, but it might continue it in terms of competition, just perhaps armed competition rather than market-based competition. At the national scale or international and global relationships, we might see changes over populations and population and migration patterns changing as a result of climate change. So this is the famous case of Tuvalu, where it's due to be underwater, and therefore people migrating away from it and creating pressure elsewhere in the world. So there's a change in population as a result of climate change, although we do need to be slightly careful about this, because much of the human geography literature actually suggests these migration patterns are historic and not just in response to climate change. But climate change is going to have an impact in terms of population structures. What about state investment then? This is what Enrico was talking about yesterday, or one of the mechanisms. Investment in infrastructure, and Nikos picked up on this as well. Where do we need to see infrastructure take place, and what happens if sea level rise continues and flooding increases to wash out existing public infrastructure? Then there'll need to be a change in the location of that infrastructure, and that will bring it with it attendant benefits to new parcels of land that will unlock land value change in those locations as well. We can also think about zoning and planning permission as the state's activity in creating land value. We can still see in the UK at the moment, in England, we're giving planning permission to houses that are on floodplains. They're actually very popular, surprisingly, and you can pay a premium for some of these locations to be underwater soon. But the enacting of a zoning or a planning permission in these contexts changes the value of the land. So from agricultural to residential, tenfold increase in land values, despite the fact that climate change is happening and that flooding is likely to become more consistent in the future. So there are many examples of planning authorities giving permission for developments in non-sustainable or resilient locations. We might think of some of the examples that have already been given this morning as well. And land value capture is just one of the ways in which the state can act, both for good and for evil in many ways, in order to respond to that change. We might also think about changes in societal values, though, in a slightly more optimistic way. There is no plan B, Greta Thunberg, etc. Changing societal values and changing the way that we think about land and the necessity to protect it and look after our environment and not just rinse it for all of the resource that we can get out of it. However, the literature on societal perceptions is pretty sad too, and there's quite a lot of evidence that particularly scientific evidence makes almost no difference to public perceptions of climate change or of land needs afterwards. Okay, so hopefully that's a bit of background about some of the various ways in which land values change arising from climate change in relation to Hongenbury Baker's view. How about a view from the coast? Well, there's loads of benefits of being at the coast. This is Liverpool, this is where I'm from. If I go for a walk, I kind of look out over that. There are loads of benefits. Lebanon and Beirut in particular is used to this, so grew up as a port establishment and grew as a city basically from the port outwards because of the benefits of being close to the sea, fishing, transportation, etc., etc. They're not always universally realised, those benefits, though, and there's obviously a role for the states to play in making sure that those benefits are actually accrued. There's also costs of living at this land-sea interface. There have always been hazards there. This is a picture from Alaska, from an earthquake and tsunami damage. And those historic events have always taken place. There's always been potential for damage at coastal locations. But through climate change, we're likely to see an increase in the frequency and potentially the scale of damage that arises in these locations. The point here is that the coast is a dynamic system. We see land often as fixed and something that we can draw neat boundaries around, but the reality is it's changing over time. This is a view of a river that was the most significant river in the northwest of England at the same time that the Romans were occupying Beirut. The Romans were occupying northwest England, and they built a city called Chester. It was the largest river, but because of the coastal dynamics and the fluvial dynamics, that river is now almost entirely silted up over about a period of about 100, 150 years, which is actually why Liverpool is now the major significant port. And you've heard of Liverpool and have never heard of Parkgate, which is this village on the hill, but was actually the most significant port for migration into England in the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. So these coastal processes are dynamic and changing the structures of land values, and they've always done that. But they may well be increasing in rapidity through coastal change as well. 17% of the UK and Ireland coastline is experiencing erosion. We love to build our homes on precipices, and this is causing a major impact for many, many households as they see literally their homes and their property values tumble into the sea. But it's not universal. It's obviously widely distributed, but inequitably distributed, those risks. This is a map of sea level rise and a 2 meter sea level rise and a 1 in 100 year sea storm surge. The risks are highly variegated, from Southport in the north to Wallasey and West Kirby. This is where I live, in the middle of Birkenhead, so I'm quite safe. But those risks are highly variable, but they're overlaid on top of an existing urban morphology at a regional scale. And so there are questions about equity and justice, about whose homes we should actively protect and build infrastructure for, and whose homes are going to be let go, and what's going to happen to the loss of land value in those locations, and how are we going to support people to move into potentially more secure, safe locations in the future. This is my understanding of land and land value capture. If you don't understand this picture, neither do I. It's a piece of modern art that's reinterpreting the construction industry as something that brings light and hope to us all. The Scottish Land Commission say that land value capture is a concept rather than a specific policy proposal, and as such can mean different things to different people. And one of the questions that we've got as academics in this room is to sift through that and understand the concepts that do underpin those definitions and highlight the contextually variegated nature of those different definitions and understand the significance of those differences. Very, very briefly, I want to talk about defining land. I'm ignoring value and capture in this title. Classical economists have identified land, labour and capital. You'll all be very familiar with that. But essentially, land was primarily used to describe natural resources, which actually means anything. It doesn't mean what's under our feet, terra firma. It means anything that's not created by human effort. And that actually means that we open up the scope of land value capture to a much broader conceptualization of nature and beyond just terra firma. And we could think about the sea as a resource, and air, as we talk about air rights, as a resource, three-dimensional space beyond the land, as potential for land value capture. Part of the focus on land is because geographers and economists in our wisdom have tended to focus on terrestrial notions of land. So by that I mean terra firma rather than maritime or air, etc. as part of that. We do that partly because terrestrial notions of land can be quite easily divided. It's much easier to draw a map than it is to draw a three-dimensional model of a city and understand the rights and obligations in three-dimensional space. And it's much easier to draw boundaries around land than it is in the sea, where there are less kind of obvious markers for demarcating rights and responsibilities in these different locations. And it's no surprise then that the OECD and Lincoln Institute's work on land value capture focuses on terrestrial notions of land. It's entirely understandable given the focus for a couple of hundred years of geography. I don't know what that noise is, but I hope you're enjoying it. Terrestrialization and territorialization, though, raises the kind of question of whether we should be thinking about this as land or as something that we can demarcate as our own territory. So is this terrestrial, or is this our territory that we can put neat boundaries around? Water obviously covers the majority of the earth, but our theorization is focused on land. Since the Industrial Revolution, oceans have been ignored by economic geography primarily, although they weren't actually in antiquity. They were a major part of economic geography, because they are less suitable places for fixed capital investments, although some of that's changing with oil industry and the creation of new territories as island states that China in particular is doing at the moment. When the concept of land value capture was being advanced, though, it firmly was embedded within this terrestrial notion of land. But we might want to rethink that. We might want to broaden our conceptualization of land beyond to include the maritime, but also to include other aspects of nature. I'm going to very, very briefly give you some food for thought here. And this is the relationship actually that Nikos has already been talking about, the dynamic relationship between land and the sea. And where land value accrues is not necessarily where value comes from. And you can see that in our desire to be close to the sea, but you can also see that in population movements and the fact that people bring value from other locations to increase competition for a particular parcel of land in those kind of migration contexts. What might coastal value capture look like? It looks like recognizing the relationship between the territorial and the maritime environment. So we need to recognize that value occurs all over this image, not just in the kind of CBD, but up in the suburban periphery, but also actually in the water that's in front of us, whether that's fishing rights or the rights of ocean liners and hotels on boats to kind of dock in these locations. This understanding of land as being beyond the territorial and into kind of water also brings with it question marks about climate change in particular, because the coast is one of the locations where these dynamic changes are going to be most felt. So people have already talked about how we can use land value capture to shift infrastructure, but the question is how we see that in relation to the kind of various aspects within nature. If we go beyond just the territorial, can we conceptualize land value capture as something that incorporates the changes that occur because of climate change, but also introduce new spaces of land as well? Just very, very finally, a quick warning though, as with all of our discussions around land value capture. It's a public policy instrument, so it can be used to justify all sorts of nebulous and nefarious activities as well by the state. It will continue to rely on the market, so it will be shaping but not determining outcomes, and it could exacerbate inequalities if it's poorly or partially implemented. And it, obviously, as Enrique finished yesterday, it's only one part of the planning toolkit and needs to work with other policies as well. Thanks for your time.
Sorry, we didn't manage the time very well. So I'm just gonna jump into asking you specific questions, like burning questions I got from your interventions, and then we can open the floor. And to be honest, I found it a little bit hard to find parallels between the three of the presentations at the beginning. It's interesting to see Deena's presentation with Nikos' presentation, the spectrum of informality from low income to high income areas and how the state is dealing with it. And in that direction, I would like to ask you, and looking at the local action plans, they seem to me like more acupuncture planning or improvement. And this brings in this question, is there always this thin line beyond which any improvement in informal settlements would lead to relocation or gentrification, because the value created from it is much more than the planners or the authority had hoped to give to the residents of the low-income settlements, and then they would be eventually evicted. I mean, the only successful case we heard about was the one Enrique mentioned yesterday about Brazil, where the lobbying within the informal settlement was really strong, so they could stay. And moving to Greece, my impression was that the question or the problem is less climate change and more how the state is dealing with this type of informality. And you did question at the end, what is the law for if it's just legalizing everything in order to bring in the money? And it seemed to me that I'm wondering if we can call it land value capture, because it's very transactional. It's not related anymore to how the state is planning or conceiving its spaces. It doesn't even have a punitive aspect, as you mentioned in your paper. They're just trying to bring in the money, and this is not where the public is giving or planning and then recouping that value. It's just going with the flow of things. And maybe it's related that these are high income or middle to high income areas. What would have been the case if these were more like the cases of Egypt? And finally, for Richard, thank you for pushing us to think of the broader definitions of land and value and how dynamic they are, actually. And I wonder where would the concept of the commons or the management of the commons help us in redefining what is land, what is sea, who owns it, where is the value created, and where does it go?
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you, Petra, for your questions. And you asked, is this thin line always there between efforts to redevelop and replan areas that are suffering from deterioration and other desires to relocate the residents to the periphery of the city? And the short answer to that is, in many cases, yes, that tension is always present, which is why so many of these informal areas have been the center of controversy, particularly when they are on land that is in a prime location. And we see countless examples of that. And it's not a recent phenomenon, unfortunately. One of the earliest slum upgrading efforts in Egypt, which is Hay Salem in the governorate of Ismailia, and this was during the 1970s. That was a project that was in collaboration with the UNDP, if I remember correctly. And one of the main obstacles towards that upgrading project was that there was resistance from the local government, because they felt that the land was too valuable to be used to house the poor, essentially, and that this land can be used to generate profit for the government or to be sold to private developers. whereas the people that are living there can easily live anywhere else in the city. That's sort of the philosophy and the narrative that's being put forth. And we see this in areas like Maspiru that are on a very prime location on the coast of the Nile River, with a Nile view, and the numbers churning in everyone's minds about how much value that can put and how much profit it could potentially generate if used for hotels and shopping malls and cafes and restaurants, rather than being used to house the poor as it is now, and neglecting the fact that this is a very historic area with a large part of it that is actually heritage buildings. And we see that in other parts of the city as well, with tensions over desires by the residents to renovate their own homes, even at their own cost. They're not even asking for investment from the government, but that being at a standstill because the government wants to redevelop the land for private purposes. So that tension definitely always exists, and which is why I think it's so crucial that before we can begin any discussion about the potential use of land value capture to upgrade informal areas, we really need to make sure that this capture is working for the poorest of the poor and protects their place in the city rather than pushes them out.
Yeah, thank you very much. So on the first remark that you made about the focus of the paper, the focus of the paper itself is about indeed about let's say a structural characteristic of development and the allocation of development rights, and how in a context of climate change the various expressions of that practice affect, for example, social equity. Yeah, the issue, in my view, is that there's a very long and very well established set of practices and norms around development and around the way state actors and private actors engage in this process, and the norms governing this relationship. Yeah, and in the context of climate change, the issues around that, meaning the inadequate funding for infrastructure, the injustice of having the taxpayer basically funding very wealthy areas to become even wealthier, and so on, it becomes even more pronounced. Because, for example, in the case of France, and let's forget Greece for a second, but let's look into France. When there was an environmental disaster, the costs to restore the area and to pay compensation and so on, to a large extent, were borne by the taxpayer. Yeah, but those affected were mostly those who built informally, and actually built informally on the coast and so on, by actually circumventing or exploiting a loophole in the system, and so on and so forth. So for me, that's a key issue, because coastal areas, as Richard said, are areas where there's a lot of economic activity, there's big pressure for development, values go high, property values are going through the roof in Greece and in France as well. And just to answer your last question about what would happen, for example, if this was not informality of desire, this was informality of need. Environmental risk is always there. Climate change makes it more pronounced, redistributes it along different territories and so on. The mechanism in place in Greece and in France is based on, I mean, in Greece is a bit more structured, but it's based on paying a very small fee for a very big benefit, private benefit. Yeah, we're talking about prices, as you saw, from 2 to 10,000 euros per square meter, and you would pay 40 to 80 euros per square meter. So to legalize them, so basically, it's a no-brainer. Yeah, I mean, you're incentivized to do that. And in France, you pay an enormous fine, but nobody collects it. And nobody can demolish it, so basically, it's a no-brainer too. But these are wealthy areas, yeah, where this happens. So, again, in a way, it's an imaginary example because I'm not sure there are that many places where what we saw in Cairo happens, both in Greece and France. But there are poorer areas on the coast in Athens, and that's where, in my view, we would need a more strategic approach from a policy perspective. So basically, instead of not ring-fencing the fines, and that's what we're saying in the paper, ring-fence the fines, allocate them locally, for example, where you can collect fines, yeah, for legalization, okay? Make them a bit higher because they're very, very low at the moment. And you can use taxpayer money to actually fund climate adaptation and infrastructure in areas where these value uplifts don't happen because they're not attractive, because they're industrial zones along the coast, very poor areas. I mean, in Athens, a lot of them are like that. And you can allocate taxpayer money there and address the spatial and social equity issue. So that's a policy advice. It's not, yeah.
Thanks for the question as well. I think the link between the three is the point that Nikos just finished on, spatial justice and social policy, and it's the relationship between the two. The role of climate change in that is that it exacerbates our responsibilities globally. So if we're talking about land value capture as an opportunity to recoup value or financial values through state-given rights to the land, potentially sacrosanct in a country like Lebanon. Actually, that climate change brings into question many of those rights because we have responsibilities beyond just our rights as well. So my emissions for my flight coming here will impact other people more than it will impact myself. I have a responsibility there, and that will mean that somewhere else in the world there is a pressure on land. And so the relationship between rights, responsibilities and land has to be part of a broader discussion about social justice, and land rights have to be part of that discussion. We can't just continue to reward existing landowners when there are changes in the population locally, nationally, internationally arising from climate change. We have to grapple with those existing property rights. So the role of the commons in this is to understand what those property rights mean for land value capture. And I think I'd also push us to think beyond land value capture, to think about land taxation as well. So land value capture is the moment that the state can do something, normally because it can withhold permission or it can change something. But we need to think beyond that around land taxation as well as a potentially more holistic mechanism for redistributing some of these relationships between needs and responsibilities.
So we got 3 R's today: rights, responsibilities, and relationships. I'm going to take a round of 3 questions because this would be faster. I see Enrique and a hand at the back, so we can start here.
Thank you so much, all three. Was great start to the day. It's less a question and more of a comment and just kind of a outward reflection of that I'm going through. And it's picking up on the point first that Petra, the observation you made or the question you made about where is the what's the management of the commons here. That's where is that? And then picking up on Richard's last point, I think we have to fight this kind of be very clear when we're talking about land versus when we're talking about property. And if the Brazilians can convince me that air is land, then I'm pretty susceptible to being convinced that the ocean is land. But then then the conversation I think we need to have is, when does it become an object of state regulation for purposes of the comment, which is different than talking about it as a source of revenue generation or recovery, because then that gets us into the realm of what's property, and then property as an asset and as a as a mechanism for wealth accumulation. And so yesterday's, like when we talk about value capture, it's about that unearned income. And yeah, you're right, this philosophical is like, who keeps that income, and then what are the repercussions for climate change incentives on how it conditions our calculations about when we settle or don't settle the coastal areas and so forth. And then what claims we have, and it takes us in different directions, but it won't take us in different directions if we don't make the distinction between land and then property specifically. And this is what's interesting about Deena's paper and then your paper, Nikos. It's who exactly are the property owners, and when does the land become property? And I think in Deena's case, it's like there's public areas that are being settled that are speculated even by the state to become property for a capture of that value, not the land, and privatized capture value. And Nikos, in your question, as a Latin American, when I hear your use of informality is so different than the way we use informality, and in Latin America, where the informality by the core part of the definition, operational definition, is you don't own you're squatting, you're settling on property that's not yours, and it's mediated by title. And so if I were to apply that to your case, it's not about regulating informality. We're talking about non-compliance. And if it's non-compliance, then you get into I understand now exactly what you're saying about policy applications and how do you deal with the French government's like, why aren't you collecting these? You can charge as you're leaving money on the table because you're not enforcing it, or other things. But again, I think it changes the conversation a little differently when we're kind of, at least in my mind, it's like, oh, it's about non-compliance. It's not about illegal or a fuzzy property ownership. It's you're not complying with rules. And then you get into different taxes and so forth. It's not land value capture taxes. It's penalties, it's fees and so forth that get into something else. But great. But I think this is really helpful because it really means that clarity, and it kind of goes back to something that the Institute's always working with. If we're not conveying these things clearly, if we're muddling it up in our own heads, we're definitely not going to convey it clearly to the people that are actually going to want to apply or even are considering some of these tools. But thanks so much. And yes, ocean, water, I got it. Land, it's there.
Thanks. There is a hand in the back.
Hello, and thank you for both interesting presentations. So the first part of my question is, in a scope where property owners are taking charge of servicing their own land or houses, so let's think about highly informal settlements in Africa, for example. What role can the municipality have when thinking about land value capture? And the second part is, is land value capture leading to pricing out poor people who succeed in independent territorial governance from formal settlements and private properties when they cannot afford the public services or infrastructure implemented? Thank you.
Okay, one last from here.
Good morning. Thanks for 3 very fascinating presentations that have given me a lot to talk about. I want to come back to, Deena, what you said, which resonated a lot for me. You know, land value capture has got to work for the poor and protect their place in the city. But, coming from a place where, probably even more complex than what's happening in Cairo, I agree that these neighborhood plans are a way forward and to try and do this bottom up. But it creates a vicious cycle that kind of refers to a little bit the last question, that when you start doing this and when it goes well, then the place becomes popular and planned, and then it gets taken away. And you refer to this in terms of it doesn't protect against eviction. So we've seen it. I come from Kampala in Uganda, and we've seen it, where slums are then sort of now properly planned at a neighborhood level and services start coming in. The next thing that happens is gentrification, and the poor get evicted and they become middle class settlements, because suddenly it's like the most planned place in a very unplanned settlement. And so my question to you is have you thought about how you break that vicious cycle? So I think, the first part to me is very clear, that bottom up, that neighborhood, that participatory. But the second part of then when the value starts getting created and when the plans start happening, how you sort of break the cycle of then that sort of eviction piece. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Thank you all for your very interesting comments and questions. In regards to Dr. Silva's comments, I just want to touch upon two concepts that I feel are very vague in the Egyptian context. And those are the concepts of public ownership and the concept of common good. And these two concepts very much impact the way land value is captured and the way informal areas are dealt with and addressed. The concept of public ownership and the commons, that there is land that does not have a clearly defined owner. Some of the areas that I mentioned are neighborhoods that it wasn't the case of people illegally squatting on land that is state-owned, but rather areas that predate urban planning. So they were settled and inhabited before the Egyptian state started engaging in what is now become the way that urban planning is done. And so the question of who actually has the right to this land is very much a question that is up for debate, because in the minds of the residents, this is their historic right. And in the minds of the residents of the city, this is public land that belongs to all of us. And in the minds of many people within government, this is land that could potentially bring in profit to the government that they could then theoretically use to reinvest in public infrastructure. So who has the right to benefit from that land? And the other concept in regards to the common good is, again, if you replace residential lower income settlements with private recreational facilities for the consumption of upper income residents, can you really define this as the common good? But many of these projects are sometimes framed within the narrative of we are relocating this small number of residents in order for the public to benefit. And we have a case in point of that, maybe that's a bit dissimilar from other cases that I mentioned, but a more recent case of an informal area called Azbet al-Haggena, where around 8,000 to 10,000 families were relocated from that informal area to other cities outside of Cairo in order to make way for a highway that would benefit car owners, that would benefit people trying to get from one middle to upper income area of the city to another middle to upper income area of the city. So not really benefiting the residents of that area. In regard to the second question is which relates to how this local area development planning can prevent gentrification. I think that's a very, very important question. Gentrification is not something that is widely discussed and debated within Egypt's urban community. Even the term itself does not have a consensus of how to translate that term into Arabic. I don't know what the term used in Lebanon is, but sometimes it's jantara, sometimes it's, there are different translations that are used, different conceptualizations. And part of that is because we have not seen in Egypt the classical understanding of gentrification as a market-driven force that pushes people out of the city. There are many reasons for that. Part of that is due to the fact that we have two rent laws in place, and many people living in different parts of the city are still under rent control. So even when rent prices rise, they do not get pushed out of the city. So we haven't seen it as much. This phenomenon of slum gentrification is a relatively recent phenomenon, and I think it's important that we're cognizant of the fact that that might occur particularly for renters in informal areas, and understanding that people living in informal areas are not a homogeneous block of urban poor. There are power dynamics, there are socioeconomic differentiations, there are property owners and people who rent, who tend to be the poorest residents in those informal areas. There are different mechanisms up for debate as to how that can be prevented, such as making use of rent control in these areas, or putting other protection mechanisms in place. But those have not been implemented as of yet within the context that I know of.
That was an amazing answer. Sorry. I'd probably push back on the question about informal. I'm not sure it's an informal issue. So it's exacerbated in informal settlements, but it's an issue with land value capture potentially everywhere. And I think that's the point that you made at the end, that there's variegated rights within informal settlements. There are variegated rights within formal settlements as well. And we see land value capture gentrifying locations, forcing out low-income households in formal settlements within the UK. As well. So I don't know if the distinction is necessarily informal versus formal, but something to do more closely with the rights of people within those settlements. I think the relationship then between rights, land value capture and the market is one of the areas that I think is important. So I take the point entirely, Enrique, about property rather than land. That's fine. In terms of real estate being the rights to trade within the market. That trading within the market then necessitates a change in ownership somehow to get some of that value, which means that we are always dealing with contexts that are dynamic, that value is moving, and we need to think about the flows of value, not just the location of value at the point of transaction. And I think that's where I'm trying to get to in relation to thinking beyond land, but thinking about nature more broadly. We need to get to the point of understanding that it's nature holistically that provides value within a local context where it's then within a market dynamic and able to be captured through land value increase.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, very, very good points. And we grappled with those questions as well when we wrote the paper. We used the term, let's say, public value capture just to be able to redefine that issue in a way, not to focus so much on the issue of land and property and so on, but and in the examples that we found, for example, in France, as I said, the developments that were most affected were actually people who they didn't own the land, for lack of a better word. They had some rights to use that land for basically put a tent on and enjoy the coast, for example, and they built a home on them. Of course, also there were, in the case of Greece, the majority of the examples are cases where we have this non-compliance, as you called it, or basically getting more development rights that allocated. Yeah, so it's a different type of right for the property. Now, that distinction, by the way, in the legalization process is made, but is made only when it comes to basically when you build on forests, in forests. So the way that the state reasserted its property rights was in a way a very residual one. So they said, okay, look, whatever you did, build on land which is not yours, on land which is yours, or exceed the, what the development rights allocate to you and so on, fine. This is one category of, and here are the fines to it. But if you build on a forest, because constitutionally you're not allowed, I mean the constitution was what stopped them from actually legalizing those as well, then this cannot be under this umbrella of legalization. So indeed, it's a very good point. It is a different context. It's the global north. And we looked at this phenomenon, and we were trying to, in a way, find ways to define it and describe it, because we're very familiar with, let's say, the literature out there which focuses on informality in the global south and exactly what you're describing. But we're looking in Greece and France, European countries, yeah? And in many ways also, I think this is very relevant to places like Cairo or the Lebanon and so on, where there are lots and lots of shades of gray and very widespread property ownership, institutions which are a bit relaxed about things and so on. So the terms that we use try to kind of decipher that reality, and it's in a way that's why we use the term informality of desire. We use the term public value capture of, actually in this case is increasing property values and so on and so forth, yeah? To try to, in a way, define our context a bit differently and a bit better to describe these situations as opposed to situations in other parts of the world. I don't know if that covers you, but thank you very much for that. It's a very good point.
Thanks a lot. I don't think we have time for a second round because the next panel is in 10 minutes. So enjoy your coffee break, and thanks a lot for the super interesting discussion.